When there's nothing left but the fire in my chest and the air that fills my lungs, I'll hold my tears and
Welcome to Iron Rhetoric with your intrepid host, Pastor Brett McAtee. Truth forever on the scaffold, wrong forever on the throne. Yet that scaffold sways the future, and behind the dim unknown standeth God within the shadow, keeping watch above his own.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, or whatever time you're listening. We welcome you to another podcast of Iron Rhetoric. I'm Pastor Brett McAtee. I pastor a small but vibrant church in Charlotte, Michigan, which is 25 minutes south of Lansing, the state capital. And Iron Rhetoric is where I seek to persuade people that we need to think biblically, Christ-centered in all areas of life, have a Christian worldview. I write at Iron Inc., although I have not been real active there in the last probably 3 or 4 months. I need to get active there. Once again, life begins to just creep up on you. But we continue with our book review of Jeremy Carl's The Unprotected Class, How Anti-White Racism is Tearing America Apart. We should note that the reason that it's tearing America apart is that white people are being discriminated against. And what's beginning to happen, at least in small quarters, I don't think it's really a tidal wave yet, but people are beginning to notice, and they're beginning to stand up, and they're beginning to say, no, that's not going to happen. And so this anti-white racism is tearing America apart. I don't know if you really should call it anti-white racism. I guess you could call it that. I don't like calling it anti-white racism because just the whole pejorative of racism is playing into the left's hand. There's really nothing wrong with preferring your race. It's wrong to hate somebody just on the basis of their race. But loving your own race, loving your own people, is something that's completely biblical, as we've seen on Iron Inc., and I think we've talked about Iron Rhetoric as well. In this chapter, when the walls come tumbling down, Jeremy Carl deals with the issue of immigration, which is ubiquitous in terms of the subject matter. I've read Peter Brimelow's Alien Nation, which came out in the mid to late 90s on the subject of immigration, and Coulter had a book on immigration. Meg Basham has a chapter on immigration in her book, Shepherds for Sale. Carl takes a whack at immigration. I've read books on the immigration crisis in Europe and what it's doing there. So I've been over this territory a little bit. And we have to say that immigration is one of the planks for the erasure of America. It's not just that they're erasing America or they're erasing our history in our schoolrooms. It's also the case that the border, of course, is unmonitored largely. I mean, they give it a fig leaf, but people are coming over. Some say up to 20 million. I would tend to think it's probably more in the area of 30 million illegals. If so, that's just a tad lower than 10%. And so we've got a real problem here with illegality. And, of course, it's all with the purpose of couplefold, replacing the white man, but also the goal of the globalists is to turn the whole world into a melting pot. Multiculturalism or diversity, oddly enough, ends in exactly just the opposite. The pursuit of diversity or multiculturalism always leads to pouring, the analogy is pouring together all different colors of paint. Well, at the end of once you pour all the colors of paint together, you don't have diversity anymore. You have one color of paint, and that's what they're trying to do throughout the globe, and that's to the end of trying to build a global governance. So you're going to have one global people, you'll have one global state. People don't realize this, but multiculturalism requires multiracialism, is what we're talking about, and it also requires multi-faithism. So multiculturalism leads to one culture. Multiracialism leads to one race, a mutt race, and multi-faithism leads to one faith. And the pursuit of any one of those requires the pursuit of all three. But they camp on multiculturalism because it's harder to make the argument for multiracialism or multi-faithism. With multiculturalism, you can give the whole bilge that, hey, all races are good, all races are equal, and oh, isn't it wonderful that we can eat tacos here and we can eat Thai food over here? And again, without realizing that the end result is going to be smooshing it all together. And so immigration is serving a particular end of erasing any kind of national identity. By the way, that immigration is part of the reason why there's so much vitriol and hatred for the concept of nationalism. Because nationalism would be something that would deny this idea of pushing everybody together into one big global vat. I would even prefer myself more than nationalism, a regionalism, such as we had in America pre-1860, where you had different particular regions with different particular flavors. The English had different particular accents, but yet we were still understood as being Americans after we were understood as being Virginians or people from New England or people from South Carolina. But we've lost all that, and so now we just think of ourselves as Americans as opposed to the way they thought of themselves as being primarily belonging to their own particular states. Carl opens up the chapter with a quote from Theodore Roosevelt. Of course, Roosevelt was U.S. president, served after McKinley was shot and killed in 1900 and served till 1909 when Taft, his vice president, took over. Roosevelt wrote, quote, "The one absolutely certain way of bringing this nation to ruin or preventing all possibility of its continuing as a nation at all would be to permit it to become a tangle of squabbling nationalities." And of course, it was in pursuit of ending the squabbling nationalities that saw the 1924, I think it was 1924 Immigration Act signed by Calvin Coolidge that basically shut the door on immigration that was disastrous for America. And then that door remained shut for 40 years until the Hart-Celler Act. And again, I always get the date mixed up with 64, 65. And so he's talking about immigration in the context of the unprotected class. And he talks about the idea of the fact that nations, empires in history have fallen because of immigration. And so what Carl does is he notes that in history, empires and nations have often fallen because of immigration. He quotes from Rod Dreher, and I'm no fan of Rod Dreher, but here's the quote: "The massive migration of barbarians into the Roman Empire in the 4th century through 6th century changed European civilization permanently. They caused the fall of the Western Roman Empire, and centuries later, the rise of a new civilization there based on the descendants of old Roman stock and Christianized Germanic tribes. Will the latter-day descendants of those Europeans be able to hold back the barbarian invasions from Africa in the 21st century?" Of course, Europe, of course, is dealing more with the Africans invading their continent, but we have some of it here. Interestingly enough, it's not Central America anymore that's the primary unit from which these immigrants are coming, but rather it's China, if you can believe that. It's China. And so we're in a situation where we're repeating the mistakes that Rome made, and that you can extrapolate that to include the idea that part of Rome's problem was that its fighting force, its military, became so inundated with non-Romans that it collapsed from within. There was no longer the kind of loyalty that you would expect. And we're doing the same thing to the U.S. military. We're filling it with non-Americans, non-white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. And the same thing's going to happen. It's going to collapse from within because there's going to be a lack of loyalty. And here I'm down a tangent for a second here, but it's going to be far easier if the time ever comes for American troops that are not from America or not U.S. citizens in their origin, it's going to be far easier for them to shoot on protesting Americans upon orders than if it was going to be a military that was comprised of historic Americans. Carl tells us that today white people in America and throughout the West are facing the prospect of permanent minority status in countries founded by their ancestors. America and increasingly European immigration policies are not copied anywhere else in the world. China tightly controls its borders, letting in only a few thousand legal immigrants per year. In Japan, despite having the world's most rapidly aging population and shrinking workforce, just 2% of its population are immigrants, mostly from ethnically and culturally similar Asian countries. Immigrants make up less than 1% of Mexico's population. Yet increasingly, whites find themselves self-ghettoized in America and Europe, with the new leaders of the coalition of the ascendant using the institutions and socio-political mechanisms developed from European traditions in the West to seize political power at the expense of Americans of European origin. And so we can see how this is impacting the West, both America and Europe. So much so we bought into the lie that America was a nation, formed to be a nation of immigrants. That's nothing but propaganda that originated in a 1950s milieu. America was never a nation of immigrants, never intended to be a nation of immigrants until the push came post-World War II to make it increasingly that way. Indeed, the issue of immigration has always been a hot-button issue throughout American history. If you look at it, it was a hot-button issue when the Eastern Europeans and Jews were immigrating here. It was a hot-button issue when the Chinese were immigrating into the West Coast. It's been a hot-button issue in several times in American history, and frankly, it's gotten America into some trouble. I've read recently an analysis of FDR's elections, his 4 different elections, and the person writing that analysis was saying that the only reason that FDR was elected was because of the swamp of immigration that had occurred previous in that century. So immigration has been an issue, but it continues to be an issue. One wonders, though, if the genie can ever be put back into the bottle, or if you prefer, the toothpaste can be put back into the tube. And so we're not a nation of immigrants. At least that was not the original intent. Remember that the Constitution was written with the language of for us and our descendants was the language that was used, and there weren't any third worlders that were signing the U.S. Constitution or ratifying it in the ratification conventions. It was a country built for white Anglo-Saxon Christians, including some Roman Catholics in Maryland. And that's the way it was for quite some time. But now, that whole idea that it's a white nation, or even that white nation should exist, is completely underwater. He talks about the original British settlers in North America did not come to join an existing society, but to create a new one. In doing so, they took on tremendous risks. Almost 90% perished in the earliest settlements, but they were British settlers. Later, you would have some come from other parts of Western Europe, but primarily it was British or British Isle people who settled America. So it was not intended to be a nation of immigrants. As I said, the founders wrote of securing the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. That's in the preamble of the Constitution. It was not, that is, America was not a proposition nation, which is so often thumped today by Republicans and Democrats alike. It's the odd person, if you can find them, as a politician who will say that America is not a propositional nation. It was one thing that J.D. Vance said in his acceptance speech of the vice presidential nomination that I was encouraged by. He went out of his way to say America is not simply a propositional nation. Now, he might have had some qualifiers in there I might not have completely agreed with, but anybody getting up and talking about the idea that America is not just an idea, but it's also the reality of a genetic inheritance and heritage, well, at least somebody's finally saying it to some degree. Now, how much he really believes it is, well, that's anybody's guess. But at least it was said. When you look at the first Naturalization Act, extending land, it was supposed to be for free white people, and it was in the late 1790s, that language. And so America was not intended to be a nation of immigrants. I wish they had never accepted that gift of the Statue of Liberty with that stupid poem on it from Emma Lazarus, because, again, that's inconsistent with the origins of America. But it was a great propaganda piece to suggest that we are a nation of immigrants. And so to be a nation of immigrants, you have to marry with that idea, the idea of propositional nationhood, which I mentioned briefly. The idea of propositional nationhood is that you can come from anywhere in the world, anywhere in the world, any culture, any race, and if you come here and just believe in basically now equality, they might throw out liberty, but that's been so redefined. Even equality has been redefined from what the original intent was. But if you just believe in these certain ideas, if you mount these ideas, then you are an American. And of course, those of us who believe that nations are not constituted by what goes on between two persons' ears, or at least not only by what goes on between two persons' ears, but also is related to descent, just as John Jay said in that quote we said in the last podcast. We eschew this idea, we loathe this idea of America as a propositional nation. He goes on and he talks about that Americans were of European descent, which was to say virtually the entirety of the American political community, and they were fastly becoming one people. British playwright Israel Zwingli wrote in The Melting Pot, America is God's crucible, the great melting pot, where all the races of Europe are melting and reforming, Germans and Frenchmen, Irishmen and Englishmen, Jews and Russians, into the crucible with you all. God is making America, right? I think Pat Buchanan, in one of his books, talks about the America did become a distinct ethnicity, because what happened is that in America, the European cousins all married, right? So you still had this European ethnicity. You still had the white race, but you had something that now was unique and distinct from Europe, because the European cousins had not secluded themselves from one another, but had intermarried and came up with a new ethnicity, as it were. Roosevelt, a champion of American national identity and a critic of hyphenated Americans, he wrote to Zwingli, that particular play shall always count among the very strong and real influences upon my thought and my life. So the idea is that America was a European creation. I don't agree with the inclusion of the Jews here, because they've always understood themselves to be a distinct people. And so out of respect for them and their insistence that they are Jews above everything else, I don't agree with including them in all this. But the rest of that quote is pretty spot on. As we said, unhappiness over immigration has been part of our history. That began with the initial surge in immigrants during the 1830s. The Know Nothing Party arose in the late 1840s and 50s and was the original anti-immigrant political force in America. And its influence was sufficient to capture more than 20% of the seats in the U.S. House of Representatives in 1854. Some would say that immigration in the 1830s was contributory towards northern abolitionist ideas. So even that immigration, even though it came from Europe, came from a portion of Europe that was fleeing European authorities for a crackdown on Marxist revolutions. And later, even still later, more of that comes to America, so that some have written books suggesting that a good deal of Lincoln's support was from these revolutionaries immigrating from Europe into America, and they were called red Marxists or red Lincolnites. And so, again, we see how immigration has changed America over her existence. And of course, you were going to need some immigration because America was such a vast continent. And there was much consideration and debate upon just the kind of immigration was wanted. You can read quotes from Alexander Hamilton and from Benjamin Franklin discussing, but there seems to be a uniform idea that they should be Europeans and that they should be able to be people who can be self-supporting and people who can earn their own way, so to speak. Fast forward when John Kennedy made his argument that for the United States being a nation of immigrants and introduced that phrase into our lexicon. It had only been true for maybe 40 or so of the previous 350 years of our existence. And that goes then, of course, behind all the way to the first Pilgrim's Landing here. It was particularly untrue in 1958 when Kennedy argued it. Our immigrant population then was at one of the lowest points in history, but politics was politics, and so the phrase remained. And here when we start getting into this era, you start getting the push for the 1964 Hart-Celler Act, which just completely changed our immigration policy. And that was really the door that was kicked open to change everything. It's called the Hart-Celler Act. It overturned the policy that had been in effect from 1924, and it promised up and down that it would not change the demographics and so the ethnic composition of the nation. This is important because with the Hart-Celler Act, what eventually did happen is it did change the composition of the nation, the demographic and ethnic composition of the nation. And the people who said it wouldn't were damn liars. And they knew they were lying, at least some of them. Listen to some of these quotes. Here's from Teddy Kennedy, one of the guys we'd desperately love to dig up and burn and scatter his ashes over the Potomac. And his stance on this and his pushing of the Hart-Celler Act is part of the reason why Teddy Kennedy said back then, first, our cities will not be flooded. I can't do a New England accent, or I would. First, our cities will not be flooded with 1 million immigrants annually. Under the proposed bill, the present level of immigration remains substantially the same. Secondly, the ethnic mix of this country will not be upset. Contrary to the charges in some quarters, the bill will not inundate America with immigrants from any one country or area, or the most populated and deprived nations of Africa and Asia. In the final analysis, the ethnic pattern of the immigration under the proposed measure is not expected to change as sharply as the critics seem to think. All right, well, so that was in the early 1960s. Here we are in 2024. It is the Hart-Celler Act that Kennedy so adamantly supported that has brought us to the place that we were. All right, it wasn't going to happen overnight so he could get away with saying it. But because of that policy, because of the way that opened the door and changed the immigration policy, we are where we are at now. Another chap, Senator Hiram Fong, the first Asian American senator and the son of Cantonese immigrants, stated to the Senate subcommittee on the Immigration and Naturalization Act, talking about the Hart-Celler Act, he said, Asians represent 0.6% of the population of the U.S. With respect to Japan, we estimate that there will be a total for the first 5 years of some 5,391. The people from that part of the world will never reach 1% of the population. Our cultural pattern will never be changed as far as America is concerned. All right, we have well over 1% of Asians now in America. Attorney General at the time, a chap named Nicholas Katzenbach, he testified, quote, this bill is not designed to increase or accelerate the numbers of newcomers permitted to come to America. Indeed, this measure provides for an increase of only a small fraction in permissible immigration. Now, I hope that one thing that you're seeing here is that what politicians do for a living is lie. They lie. And it's no less true today than it was then. These men pursued a policy that has brought us to where we are now. And if we were familiar with our history, we should have probably dartboards with these guys' faces on it, throwing darts at these guys, because they're the ones that are responsible for bringing us to the place that we're now at. Robert Francis Kennedy, father of RFK Jr., who's now running for president. Here's what Robert Francis Kennedy said. He stated that if the bill was passed, I would say for the Asia-Pacific Triangle, immigration would be approximately 5,000, Mr. Chairman, after which immigration from that source would virtually disappear. 5,000 immigrants would come that first year, but we do not expect that there would be any great influx after that. All right, now keep in mind that the Asia-Pacific Triangle is now the number one countries, area of the world, if you please, that is now flooding over our borders in the way of the Chinese. Yeah, despite these assurances, by 1980, most immigrants were coming from Latin America, Asia, and Africa, and at least 7 million entered the U.S. legally during that decade. There has perhaps never been in all of U.S. history such a deficit between the political predictions about the impact of a piece of legislation and the reality that followed. And when this bill was passed, 88.6% of the total U.S. population was white. In 2020, the percentage of the total population of non-Hispanic white people is around 58% of America's population. This is a decrease from the 2010 census, when non-Hispanic whites made up 63.7% of the population. You probably can't get an idea, but between 1980 and 2024 is 44 years. And the change that has come in those 44 years is breathtaking. We've already basically changed out our population. We are a different people now than we were in 1980. And I graduated college just a couple years after 1980. So some of us that are my age, we're finding it more and more difficult to navigate because we have clear memories of a different world. And this is what immigration has done to us. And then you pile on top of this that all of what we've just described here was accelerated, and it was made worse by the guy that all the conservatives worship, President Ronald Reagan, when he declared amnesty for illegal immigrants in 1986, which did nothing but provide an incentive for even more illegals to come and enter America illegally. Reagan perhaps did as much as LBJ to ensure the browning of America. At least Reagan had the good sense to regret his signing of the 1986 Immigration Act. According to Ronald Reagan himself, was told to his trusted longtime friend, Attorney General Edwin Meese. According to Reagan, the biggest mistake of his presidency was signing the 1986 amnesty for what turned out to be more than half the 5 million illegal immigrants in the country at that time. And it's easy to be sorry for something after you've already done it. So clearly we see that we're now suffering the repercussions of the 1965 Hart-Celler Immigration Act and the 1986 Reagan amnesty. And this is clear to anybody who doesn't deny reality, which would include people like America's clergy class, men like Lusk, Wilson, Michael Foster, Darrell Doan, James White, Voddie Baucham, J. Ligon Duncan, Russell Moore, John Piper, Al Mohler, Tim Keller, who's deceased, Sean Michael Lucas. They all continue to insist things like there is no such thing as race, or race is a social construct, or race is only about the amount of melanin one does not have, or while ethnicity might exist, race certainly doesn't exist. And all we can say is try selling all that bills to the patient waiting to get a bone marrow transplant. All right, if you're a mixed-race child trying to get a bone marrow transplant, suddenly guess what exists? Race. But no, we don't want to talk about those realities. So we would say here the clergy in the formerly white-hat denominations are the villains now in the work of preventing a solution to our immigration social order problems. All we get from the clergy crowd is Gnostic Pollyannisms like, but the gospel has the power to destroy nature so that all that has been true throughout history no longer need be true when it comes to building social orders that have a harmony of interests. Or it's almost as if they're saying, if you'll just convert to Jesus, you no longer will have a race. You'll just be Jesus' race. Look, I long for people from every tribe, tongue, and nation to be converted to Christ. But after people from every tribe, tongue, and nation are converted to Christ, they're still going to be members of their tribes, tongues, and nations. There's still going to be differences. There's still going to be distinctness. There's still going to be uniqueness. If you bring everybody together and you put them in one country because of immigration, in the short term, you're guaranteeing conflict. You're guaranteeing a conflict of interest. So we would say in the end, the modern clergy corps is contributing to the genocide of the white man in the West, and that all in the name of the love of Jesus. Yes, genocide. Immigration is contributing to the genocide of white people. If you look at Article 2 of the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide from the United Nations, it describes genocide as any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. As such, killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to the members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. And that falls underneath this immigration. We're having deliberately inflicted upon us, white Anglo-Saxon Christians, conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. If you have any doubt about that, you look at the jobs expansion in America, and you compare the expansion, who's getting the jobs in America, the new jobs, and you compare that to the white people who are not getting the new jobs, and it's clear that what's happening is we're being deliberately inflicted with conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. In South Africa, that's true in spades. So the white man in the West is now being deliberately inflicted upon via immigration patterns and legislation conditions of life calculated to bring about the white man's physical destruction in whole or in part. I mean, for Pete's sake, if in 1980 we were still 88% white and now we're between 58 and 65%, depending on what numbers you look at, how is that not a creeping genocide? But it's okay if you genocide white people because we're white, we're Christian. If it was pointed at anybody else, that would be a problem. So all this immigration, all this saluting of immigration, all this necessity of immigration, all this idea of, well, if they just come here, then we can get them all saved. This is what I call a suicidal altruism. We are embracing the stranger and the alien at the expense and the cost of our own children and grandchildren. It's not sane, but what is sane this day? And all of this is being foisted upon us by just scads and scads of those who occupied the clergy corps. So this represents what's happened with the immigration with a thumbnail sketch. I don't know, as I've said before, I don't know if we can reverse this. We may be too far, as I said earlier, down the rabbit hole. But that's what's happened. That's what's happened to us. What I hope for, and I think I've said this before, is what I hope for is people allow secession movements to go forward so that American can secede into different countries, and maybe this is a wild dream, that one of the countries that will be formed out of a secession movement will be something that is for white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. As a result of this immigration pattern, what we see is the desire to fill America with people with little or no ties to the historic American nation. And that's become an article of faith among many in the clergy, among almost universally Democrats, and a goodly number of Republicans as well. That's part of the problem why I don't know if we can put the toothpaste back into the tube after it's been squeezed out, because it doesn't seem like we really have a champion for this. Now, Trump is talking about repatriating millions of people if he's elected. I guess I just file that under I'll believe it when I see it. Eisenhower did something like that. But it'll be extraordinarily difficult to do, especially with a political establishment that does not want to do that in the least. And remember, what's driving all this is the globalists. That's what's behind all of this. The globalists want to build a new world order. They want another Tower of Babel. Christians are the ones who are in the way. And biblical Christians are the only ones who can be consistent and be in the way. So the result of all this policy on immigration among America's children, less than half of America's children right now are non-Hispanic white. Within approximately 2 decades, America as a whole is projected to become majority minority. 2 decades. I could still be alive in 2 decades. The Great Replacement then isn't a conspiracy theory. It is, as one of the GOP presidential candidates observed, just the basic immigration policy of the Democrats. But again, I would say it's not Democrats alone. If Republicans really wanted to do something about it, they'd do something about it. But they have the Chamber of Commerce as one of their special interest groups, and the Chamber of Commerce likes cheap labor, and so it's in their interest, Chamber of Commerce, to push the Republicans to not be adamant on immigration, because that way they can get cheap labor. When whites talk about this issue like I'm doing now, when we talk about the incredibly rapid demographic transformation of the country that's taken place over the last few decades, which I looked at between 1980 and 2024, when we express concern over the place of our unique particular culture, our history, our grandchildren, or when we note that diverse societies are much more likely to suffer from tensions and frictions and interethnic violence, as well as a lack of social cohesion, we are invariably attacked as being racist. And frankly, I think we need to just get past worrying about the accusation of racist. I mean, I've taken more and more to saying, well, you say that like it's a bad thing. We just need to quit letting it injure us or damage us. Because really the people that are hurling the accusation of racist at us are the cultural Marxists. Who cares what the cultural Marxists? And so their mantra, the cultural Marxists, over and over again, diversity is our strength, diversity is our strength. Biden went out of his way to hire minorities into his cabinet, to bring women into his cabinet, to bring LGBTQIA people into his cabinet, some of the weirdest perverts that you've ever seen into his cabinet. Because why? Diversity is our strength. We're seeing now in Britain how diversity is our strength. We're seeing in France how diversity is our strength. How long are we going to listen to that mantra before we tell people to shut up? It's just obvious that diversity is not our strength. And yet the corporate world has that going on as well. I heard today in the corporate world, a Delta Airlines spokesman, a muckety-muck, buying into the whole woke mantra, which this is all part of. And she said, well, we really need to, I'm paraphrasing here, we really need to examine the language you use when we call for boarding in the gate. And I used to be a gate agent, and so I knew, about the language that's used in order to board people on the airplanes. And she was complaining about the fact that the gate agents use the language of ladies and gentlemen. We're about to board flight 737 from Columbia, South Carolina to Chicago. And then we go on from there. And what she's saying is that term, ladies and gentlemen, that may not be sensitive enough. Right? So this is the kind of stuff that you get with this diversity is our strength mindset. You try to appeal to the lowest common denominator. So how would we move on or wrap up here? Well, we would note Carl says it's been a consistent finding of social science research that multi-ethnic societies suffer from low social trust, and that low social trust does not just occur between ethnic groups, which might be expected, but even within ethnic groups. That is, in a multi-ethnic society, Asian Americans trust even other Asian Americans less. Furthermore, high levels of diversity has been shown to be damaging to trust among neighbors, those who actually get to know each other, rather than a simple case of ethnic balkanization built out of the self-interest or fear of an other who is unknown to you. When we, as white Christians, we mention the fact that we don't like being replaced, we don't like our culture and historical symbols challenged or changed, or even eliminated outright, we're called bigots, white nationalists, and as I said earlier, racist. When the left celebrates the same demographic transformation, it's expected and welcome and part of America's continued march towards a brighter, happier, and more diverse future. So if you're opposed to this, and this is one of the reasons, this issue that we're looking at, this is one of the reasons that I was put on the Southern Poverty Law Center list, because I dare say that this rampant immigration isn't a good idea, and that America was made originally to be a white nation, that propositional nationhood isn't true, that diversity is not our strength, and all of those things landed me on the SPLC list, and that's the same treatment that anybody's going to get who says these kinds of things, if you have any kind of position, I guess. I mean, I'm still floored by the fact that they worried about me to put them on their stupid list. So we need to start taking it as a matter of pride. Keep in mind with what's happening with this immigration, it's no longer the case that they're being expected to assimilate to our culture, but it's working the other way around. We're the ones that are being expected to assimilate to their patterns, their culture, their way of doing things. That's one reason the Brits are so outraged right now, is because it's clear that British culture is evaporating. And you know what? If you can find the Rivers of Blood speech by Enoch Powell, who was a British politician in the 1960s, you can cue that up. You can find it on YouTube. You can read it. You can find it online. Enoch Powell, I keep saying Enoch. I have a grandson. It's not Enoch, it's Enoch. I constantly being reminded that it's Enoch. Enoch Powell warned in the 1960s where all this was going, this immigration issue in Britain. And he said he foresaw rivers of blood. And now, I just wish there's some descendant of Enoch Powell somewhere saying, I told you so, he told you so, he told you so. Because right now, the Brits are experiencing or seeing this river of blood. But again, the Brits brought it upon themselves by not standing with Enoch Powell once upon a time. They turned a blind eye, and now it's come back to bite them. So this immigration problem, here I'm going to go on a limb, probably say something controversial, but I'm going to say it anyway. The immigration problem that we have is a greater issue, a greater threat to America than the abortion issue. Now, I'm not lessening how wicked abortion is. I'm just saying that if these immigration patterns continue, that it's going to completely destroy us as a people. And of course, abortion is tied to all this, because if we hadn't been killing all of our babies, if we hadn't had 73, 23, 50, over 50 million abortions, we certainly wouldn't be. The argument couldn't be made that we need more people here to pay into the social safety net, as if that's a cohesive argument or a rational argument anyway. That's just blowing smoke. So immigration is a problem. Jeremy Carl gets at the fact that it's a problem. I've tried to trace a little bit of the history of the problem that Carl doesn't go into. I don't know if it can be fixed, folks. I mean, part of me thinks, especially in this election cycle, if it isn't worked on after this election cycle, then it can't be fixed. And so clearly, the Marxist Harris isn't going to work. I mean, she's the border czar. She's the one that's responsible for the fact that we're in the situation we're in. And I'm not confident that Trump will really do anything about it. But he's more likely to do something about it than Harris. But if we don't fix this problem, well, it's just going to get even more ugly than it is. I hate ending on a downer like that. I guess I should remind us, all of us, remind myself, remind my wonderful tech guy, Matt, that he already knows this, that God is sovereign. And why we analyze these problems, why we speak of these problems, in order to prove that we're not Pollyanna, at the same time, we have to say the Lord God omnipotent reigneth. At the same time, we have to understand that he sits in heaven and laughs at the desire of the wicked to overthrow Christ. Because that's the intent. America has largely been a nation influenced by Christian categories. It's wandered a long ways, to be sure. But what this immigration process does is it pushes us away more and more faster from any sense of Christian tenets. The whole idea is to bring in a people who will just be deaf and dumb to those historic ideas that formed America. And so we end on a up note that God is sovereign, he's not asleep, and we can entrust ourselves to him and say God is in heaven and all is well on the earth. And that's the last word I have to say for this issue of Iron Rhetoric, wherein we continue to march through Jeremy Carl's book, The Unprotected Class, How Anti-White Racism is Tearing America Apart. Do yourself a favor, try to educate yourself on these matters. Read Brimelow's Alienation, though it's old. Read Ann Coulter's work on immigration. Read Christopher Caldwell's work on immigration in Europe. The title of it slips me right now. You can read Meg Basham's chapter on immigration, how we've been lied to by our clergy leaders on that subject. And I guess I should end by saying this is not a matter of saying I hate all non-white European people. That's not true at all. Matter of fact, love for them is as much a part of this equation as anything else, because when the Titanic goes down, when the country goes down, everybody goes down that's on the Titanic. Everybody goes down that's in the country. And so there's a consideration here for all peoples, but yes, most especially for the white Anglo-Saxon Christian, and there's no shame in that. God bless, and good night from Matt Smith, my wonderful tech, and from myself here at Iron Rhetoric. Remember, the Lord does not sleep, neither does he slumber. All is well. Good night.
Oh, brothers, can you hear my voice, or am I all alone? If there's no fire to guide my way, then I will start my own.
Thank you for joining us today. Look for us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube Music. Be sure to give us a 5-star review, like, and share.